Some songs don't shout. They whisper, and those are the ones that cut the deepest. 1975 was not just a year for revolution in reggae, it was a year when singers stood still and broke your heart wide open.
Takes them away and you don't.
But most people never knew the real stories behind these ballads. Stolen credits, record label wars, teenagers making timeless music with nothing in their pockets. You think you know these songs? You don't know their stories? 10 ballads, 10 hidden truths. This is the music that made grown men cry. Number 10, Louisa Mark, Caught You in a Lie. Close your eyes for a second. Picture a basement room in London. 1975, the walls are sweating. There is a sound system in the corner, red, gold, and green decorations on the wall, and then this voice comes on young, soft, almost fragile, and the whole room goes quiet. That is what Caught You in a Lie felt like the first time people heard it. It was not the hard root sound coming out of Kingston. This was something gentler, something brand new. Louisa Mark was just 14 years old when she recorded this song. 14, she was a schoolgirl from West London with a voice that sounded like she had lived 40 years of heartbreak already. The song is simple. It is about catching someone you love telling a lie. That feeling of looking at someone and knowing deep in your chest that something is not right. Every person who has ever been in love has felt that moment, and she sang it like she meant every single word. This track is widely recognized as the very first lovers rock record ever made. Lovers rock was a whole new style reggae mixed with soul, made by and for young black British people. It would go on to define an entire generation, and it all started with this song. In 1975, here is something most people do not know. Louisa Mark did not set out to be a singer. She just had a gift. The people around her recognized it. And when the track was done, nobody predicted it would become the foundation of an entire genre. The session was casual. The result was historic because it was made in London, not Jamaica, and some reggae purists of the time did not fully embrace it. It existed in between worlds, not quite British pop, not quite Jamaican roots. That in-between space kept it from getting the full respect it deserved on either side of the Atlantic. Over time, the legends who followed Dennis Brown, Gregory Isaacs, Janet Kay, they all built on what Louisa Mark started, but her name rarely gets the credit it should. Good, that one deserved more shine. But the next song, this one actually made it to the top of the charts. In the UK, number 9 is coming up, and you will feel every word. Number 9, The Mighty Diamonds, Right Time. If you ever heard 3 voices locked together so tight they become one, you will understand why the Mighty Diamonds made people stop breathing for a moment. Right Time is not just a song, it is a feeling. It is that moment when you know something bigger is coming: justice, freedom, change, and you are just waiting for the right time to arrive. Picture a record shop in Kingston, 1975. Someone drops the needle, the harmony comes in, and everyone in the shop looks up from what they are doing. The Mighty Diamonds, Donald Shaw, Lloyd Ferguson, and Tabby Diamond recorded this at Channel 1 studio in Kingston with producer Joseph Hookham. Channel 1 was one of the hottest studios on the island at the time. Sly Dunbar, Robbie Shakespeare, and the Revolutionaries were the house band. The rhythm was tight, the vocals were tighter. Right Time is a song of deep Rastafarian faith. It speaks about waiting on Yah, waiting for the right moment when things will finally be made right in the world. For people living through poverty, police pressure, and political tension in Jamaica in the mid-70s, those words were not just music, they were a lifeline. The track spread through sound systems across Jamaica through 1975, before the international album version came out on Virgin Records in 1976. By then, it was already a roots classic. The Mighty Diamonds were so well regarded in Jamaica that Bob Marley himself was said to be a fan of their harmonies. Their three-part blend was considered some of the most precise vocal work in reggae at the time. No auto-tune, no tricks. Just three men who had been singing together so long they could read each other's breath. Roots reggae harmony trios never got the same mainstream shine that solo artists did. When reggae crossed over internationally in the late 70s, it was largely through individual stars. The Mighty Diamonds stayed respected in the community but never quite broke through to the level their talent deserved. Also, the shift to dancehall in the early 80s left a lot of roots harmony music behind. Right Time became a cult classic rather than a household name outside of reggae circles. Deep harmony, deep faith, number 9 done. But if you think that was emotional, wait until you hear number 8. This one will remind you that reggae was always about more than love. It was about memory.
All right, C-Trends fam, let's keep it real. We're pouring our hearts into bringing you the best celebrity news and music deep dives. What? Check it. A massive 98% of you aren't subscribed yet. Subscribing is how you can truly support us, helping us grow and create even better content. If you're vibing with what we do, take a sec to hit that subscribe button. It's free and makes a huge difference. Plus, ring that notification bell so you never miss out. Let's flip that 98% and build this C-Trends family together. Your support is everything.
Every story you see here takes hours of digging, piecing together history, and bringing forgotten moments back to life. If you'd like to support that work, you can become a channel member. It's just the cost of a cup of coffee, but it helps us keep these stories alive, and for that, we're grateful. Number 8, Burning Spear, Slavery Days.
So do you remember the days of slavery?
This is not a ballad in the usual sense. There is no love story here. There is no woman waiting, no man pleading, but if you have ever heard this song in the dark, really listen to it, you will know why it belongs on this list. Slavery Days is a spiritual ballad. It is slow, it is heavy. Winston Rodney's voice comes in like a man carrying the weight of generations.
So do you remember the days of...
You feel it in your chest before you even understand the words. Burning Spear, born Winston Rodney in St. Anne, Jamaica, recorded Slavery Days as part of the Marcus Garvey album in 1975. The album was produced by Jack Ruby and recorded at Channel One. It is now considered one of the greatest reggae albums ever made. The song asks a question that cuts deep. It asks, do you remember the days of slavery? And it asks it not to accuse, not to make you angry. It asks to make sure you never forget, because forgetting, Spear was saying, is its own kind of death. Marcus Garvey, the album, and the man it honors was about the Pan-African movement Black Pride and the idea that history must be remembered, not buried. Slavery Days was the emotional heart of that message. Jack Ruby, the producer, insisted on a stripped-down sound for the album. Very little overdubbing, very little sweetening. He wanted the rawness to stay, and that rawness is exactly why Slavery Days still hits the same way 50 years later. It was not polished, it was honest. Because because it is not a love song, radio programmers and mainstream gatekeepers did not know what to do with it. It was too political for pop radio, too spiritual for dance hall, and too rootsy for the crossover market that was opening up for reggae in the mid-70s. But in the reggae community, Slavery Days is holy. It is one of those songs you pass down to your children and say, listen to this. This is where we came from. Roots, Truth, Fire, that was number 8. But coming up number 7 is Pure Lover's Music, a ballad so romantic it became the blueprint for an entire style, Stay With Me. Number 7, John Holt, For the Love of You. If there is one voice in reggae that could make the whole world slow down and listen, it was John Holt. The man was built for ballads. His voice was warm like afternoon sun on a Kingston veranda, smooth, deep, unhurried.
Drifting on a memory.
For the Love of You is exactly the kind of song you put on when the night is quiet and someone is close and you just want the moment to last. It wraps around you like a slow dance at the end of a blues dance when half the room has gone home and the bass line is just barely rumbling.
Ain't no place I'd rather be than with you.
John Holt was already a giant by 1975. He had been making music since the mid-60s with the Paragons. He wrote The Tide is High, the same song Blondie took to number 1 around the world years later. He had topped the Jamaican charts for 23 consecutive weeks with Stick By Me in 1972. By 1975, John Holt had become the kind of singer people described as a forerunner of lovers rock. His style was slower, more romantic, more vulnerable than most of his contemporaries. For the Love of You dropped that year and confirmed what everyone already felt. Nobody in reggae could croon like John Holt. His string-led albums on Trojan Records in the UK had already made him an international name. For the Love of You connected with that same crossover audience, people who loved the reggae rhythm, but also wanted that tender, soulful delivery that Holt made his trademark.
Day will make the way.
John Holt once attended a King Tubby sound system dance and heard U-Roy toasting over one of his own songs. He was so blown away that he personally introduced U-Roy to Duke Reid, launching one of the most legendary DJ careers in reggae history. The crown of reggae helping build the next generation, even as he was at the top of his own game. Holt released so many songs across so many producers and labels through the 70s that individual gems got swallowed by the sheer volume of his output. If you were not a serious collector, it was easy to miss For the Love of You among the dozens of singles he dropped that era. Also, as the reggae world moved toward roots and consciousness in the late 70s, the pure romance of Holt's ballads was sometimes dismissed as too soft, too commercial. That was deeply unfair to a man who was a master of his craft. The Crown of Lovers Reggae, number 7 on. But number 6, this one goes to a different place entirely. A man whose voice was so raw, so broken, so beautiful that Lee Perry himself could not leave him alone. Coming up next. Number 6, Junior Byles, Curly Locks. Picture a recording session at Lee Perry's Black Ark studio late at night. The room is small, the walls are covered in carvings and paintings and old records, there is incense burning, and this man, Junior Byles, steps up to the microphone and sings a love song so honest it almost sounds like a confession. Curly Locks is a roots love ballad. It is slow, swaying, almost tormented. A Rastaman reaching out to a girl whose father does not want her near him because of his faith and his dreadlocks. You feel every word. Junior Byles had already proven himself as one of the deepest voices in reggae. His earlier work included roots anthems like Beat Down Babylon. Powerful political music, but Curly Locks showed a different side. It showed the man behind the Rasta warrior, vulnerable, longing, human. Lee "Scratch" Perry produced the track at his legendary Black Ark studio in Kingston. Perry was at the height of his powers in 1975, building sounds that nobody else could replicate, using his 4-track machine like it had 20 channels. The rhythm on Curly Locks has that signature Black Ark feel, deep, echoing, slightly otherworldly. The song hit the UK reggae chart in 1975 and became the track most associated with Junior Byles' name. For reggae fans in London's blues dances and record shops, it was a slow dance essential. Lee Perry later described his recording process at the Black Ark by saying he was picking up extra signal from somewhere beyond the 4 tracks on his machine. Whether you believe that or not, something in those sessions produced magic that modern studios with unlimited tracks still cannot recreate. Curly Locks is proof of that. Junior Byles' story is one of the most heartbreaking in reggae. In late 1975, he received news of the death of Emperor Haile Selassie, the figure at the center of Rastafarian faith, and it deeply affected his mental health. His recording career slowed and then stopped. A man with one of the most beautiful voices reggae ever produced disappeared from the scene just as Curly Locks was connecting with people worldwide. The music world moved on, but anyone who ever heard Junior Byles at his best never forgot him. A voice that should have lasted forever. Number 6, done. We are halfway through the countdown, and the next 5 songs are the ones people remember most. But here's what I need to ask you before we go further. Number 5, Gregory Isaacs, Love is Overdue. If you have ever stood in a room and felt the whole world shrink down to just you and a memory, this is the song. Gregory Isaacs had a voice that sounded like cool water on a hot day, smooth, precise, and underneath it something aching. Love is Overdue is for the person who has been alone too long. The person who has loved and lost and is standing in the wilderness of it asking, when is it my turn? When does love come back? That question, that ache, it never goes out of style. Gregory Isaacs recorded Love is Overdue in 1974 with producer Alvin Ranglin for GG Records. It became his first #1 single in Jamaica. By 1975, it was everywhere on the island, at christenings, at weddings, on sound systems, on late-night radio. A #1 hit played at weddings tells you everything. And this song was not just popular, it was loved. Isaacs ran his own label, African Museum, in Kingston, one of the first artists of his generation to control his own recordings. He was young, ambitious, and deeply talented, and Love is Overdue was the moment Jamaica recognized all 3 of those things at once. Isaacs was a carpenter by trade before music fully took over. He built things with his hands before he built a career with his voice, and that sense of craft, of building something carefully, piece by piece, you can hear it in how he constructs a melody. Nothing wasted, every note in exactly the right place. Now, I told you at the beginning that one story was coming that you were not ready for. This is the one closest to it. Gregory Isaacs is widely considered one of the greatest voices reggae ever produced. By the mid-70s, respected artists, including peers far more famous, were publicly saying he was the most gifted singer in the genre. And yet, for most of the decade, the UK and American markets barely knew his name. Some people say the distribution system at the time actively worked against Jamaican artists who ran their own labels. The major reggae distributors in the UK had deals with certain producers and studios. An independent artist like Isaacs, putting out music on his own African museum label, was at the back of the line, regardless of how good the music was. In interviews, it has been said that Isaacs recorded more music in the 1970s than almost any other reggae artist alive, and yet, because of how the deals were structured, a fraction of that music ever reached international fans. Its songs that were number ones in Jamaica never even got pressed for the UK market. There are different versions of the story, and Isaacs himself never fully opened up about the business side in public. But the pattern is clear. A man with a number one hit, running his own operation with the talent of 10 singers and the wider world, had to wait until 1982's Night Nurse to finally understand what Jamaica had known since 1974. The legacy of Love Is Overdue was not hurt by this. If anything, it made it more precious to those who found it. A hidden gem guarded by bad deals and missing distribution, the Cool Ruler's first crown, buried in a drawer for years. That is what happens when the music industry decides who gets heard and who gets left behind. And it happened to one of the best, because the world was not paying attention yet. So not to Gregory Isaacs specifically, the international reggae spotlight in 1975 was almost entirely on Bob Marley and the Wailers. Anyone not in that beam was in shadow, no matter how good they were. Gregory Isaacs spent years building his reputation brick by brick in Jamaica before the world caught up. Love Is Overdue deserved a worldwide audience in 1975. It got one eventually. Just 20 years too late. The Cool Ruler deserved better, but the 4 songs ahead of him on this list, they are the ones that moved mountains. Number 4 is a voice so strong that even Bob Marley said he was the best. Coming right up. Number 4, Dennis Brown, Westbound Train. Bob Marley, that is who you think of first when you think of reggae. Every time, but there was a man in Jamaica in the mid-70s whose voice was so extraordinary that Bob Marley himself publicly on record said this man was the greatest reggae singer in the world. That man was Dennis Brown, and Westbound Train is where you feel exactly why Marley said it. Close your eyes and listen to it. You will understand in 10 seconds. Dennis Brown was barely in his early 20s when he cut this with producer Winston "Niney" Holness for Observer Records. Niney had a gift for finding the right rhythm for the right voice. And when he put Dennis Brown in front of that rhythm, something special happened. Westbound Train is a roots ballad about being pulled away from the place and the people you love. Whether you hear it as a love song or a deeper metaphor for the Jamaican experience of migration, it works on every level. The train is going, and there is nothing you can do to stop it. The song was part of a remarkable run of recordings Brown made with 90 in the early to mid-70s sessions that produced multiple classics and were eventually gathered on the Just Dennis album in 1975. Those sessions made Dennis Brown a household name in Jamaica. When Dennis Brown was a teenager, Bob Marley would come and listen to him sing. Not to perform himself, just to listen. That is how good Dennis Brown was. The biggest name in reggae came as an audience member, and Marley was not shy about telling people what he thought. He called Brown the best, end of story. Because Dennis Brown released so much music, over 200 albums across his career, individual songs got lost in the volume. Westbound Train sits in the middle of an incredible body of work, and unless you were digging through every release, it was easy to miss. Also, like so much mid-70s reggae, the track was never properly reissued or promoted for modern streaming audiences. It lives in the collections of dedicated fans and on obscure vinyl pressings, waiting for people to find it. The Crown Prince at his finest. Number 4 done. 3 songs left, and every one of them is a landmark. Number 3 is where the controversy story reaches its peak. A song that started a war between 2 record companies. Stay right here. Number 3, Susan Cadogan. Hurt So Good.
First you take my heart in the palm of your hand and squeeze.
Imagine walking into Lee Perry's Black Ark studio for the first time. You are a librarian. You are not a professional singer. You have never made a record in your life. And then you open your mouth, and the producer looks up from the desk and quietly decides he is going to record everything you have to say.
Then you take my mind.
Hurt So Good is the sound of a voice discovering itself. It is warm and tender and slightly aching, perfect for a slow dance in a London basement in 1975, the kind of song that makes the room stop and breathe together.
Play with it all night. You take my pride.
Susan Cadogan was working as a librarian at the University of the West Indies when she walked into a recording session through a connection with a friend. Lee Scratch Perry was in the room. That he heard her sing and decided to record an album's worth of material with her on the spot.
And you throw it up against the wall.
The song was a cover of a Millie Jackson soul classic, but what Perry and Cadogan made with it was something different entirely. They slowed it down. They gave it space. Boris Gardner played bass. The Zap Pow horns came in, and Cadogan's voice floated over all of it like smoke.
Take me in your arms, baby. Bounce me like a rubber ball.
In Jamaica, the record came out on Perry's own Perry's label and barely moved. Nobody paid attention. Then it got picked up in the UK, licensed to Magnet Records, and climbed all the way to number 4 on the UK singles chart in 1975.
I'm not complaining. What you doing? You
Cadogan was on top of the pops. The song was certified silver in the UK and gold in South Africa. One of the top-selling singles of the year. Susan Cadogan did not believe it was happening when she got the call.
cause this hurting feeling.
In interviews, she has described the whole thing as a shock. She had recorded the song almost casually, did not think much of it, and then suddenly she was flying to London and appearing on national television. From a library in Kingston to Top of the Pops in under a year. That is a story.
So good to me, 'cause don't you know?
Because what happened next buried the song in legal chaos. 2 record companies, Magnet and Trojan, went to war over who owned the rights to Cadogan's recordings. Perry had licensed his material to one side, Cadogan was signed to the other. Every follow-up single had a competing version released by the rival label at the same time. Cadogan received very little money from her biggest hit. The legal battles drained the momentum from her career. She went back to her library. What a woman who reached number 4 in the UK and touched millions of people, and the industry left her with almost nothing. Hurt So Good is not forgotten, but the woman behind it deserves so much more than she got.
It hurts so good.
From a library to the UK top 5, and then the system took it away. Number 3 done, 2 songs left, and number 2 is the one that some people say should have been number 1. A man with a voice like Sam Cooke, a song that crossed every border, coming up. Number 2, Ken Boothe, Everything I Own.
You sheltered me from.
There are moments in music when a voice is so right for a song that you cannot imagine anyone else singing it. When Ken Boothe steps into Everything I Own, that deep, warm, gospel-drenched delivery, it stops being a cover and becomes something completely its own.
Kept me warm.
This is late night music. This is the song you put on when the house is empty and the feeling is too big for words. Ken Boothe makes big feelings sound simple, and simple is the hardest thing in the world to do.
Kept me warm.
Everything I Own was originally written and recorded by Bread, the American soft rock group. David Gates wrote it as a tribute to his late father. Ken Boothe and producer Lloyd Chalmers took that song, stripped it down, and wrapped it in a reggae rhythm that made it feel like it was always Jamaican.
You gave my life to me.
Boothe's voice was often compared to Sam Cooke, that same combination of church and street, of power held carefully in check. When he sings, you believe him completely. Every word. The Trojan Records release hit number 1 on the UK singles chart in late 1974 and continued to define the reggae landscape through 1975.
Set me free. Set me free.
It was one of the first reggae songs to reach that commercial height in Britain, and it opened doors for every artist who came after. Ken Boothe came out of a tradition of Jamaican vocal excellence that stretched back through Studio One. He had been making music since the mid-60s and had built a reputation across multiple eras of Jamaican music.
The finest cheers.
By the time Everything I Own put him at number 1 in the UK, he had already been a star in Jamaica for nearly a decade. The world finally caught up. Because crossover success is a double-edged thing in reggae. When Everything I Own reached the top of the pop charts, some in the community felt it was too polished, too mainstream, too far from the roots.
I ever knew.
That tension between commercial success and cultural authenticity followed the song for years. But here is the truth. Ken Boothe's version is one of the most emotionally powerful reggae recordings ever made. The fact that millions of people who had never heard reggae before were moved by it is not a weakness. That is what music is supposed
All the years I have with you, and I would
to do. Number 2, the one that went to number 1, but there is only one song that could be at the top of this list. One song, one night, one room, one voice that changed reggae forever. Number 1 is next.
All right, C-Trends fam, let's keep it real. We're pouring our hearts into bringing you the best celebrity news and music deep dives. What? Check it. A massive 98% of you aren't subscribed yet. Subscribing is how you can truly support us, helping us grow and create even better content. If you're vibing with what we do, take a sec to hit that subscribe button. It's free and makes a huge difference. Plus, ring that notification bell so you never miss out. Let's flip that 98% and build this C-Trends family together. Your support is everything.
Every story you see here takes hours of digging, piecing together history, and bringing forgotten moments back to life. If you'd like to support that work, you can become a channel member. It's just the cost of a cup of coffee, but it helps us keep these stories alive, and for that, we're grateful. Number 1, Bob Marley and the Wailers. No Woman, No Cry. There is a studio version of this song. Nobody talks about the studio version. What everyone talks about, what changed the course of reggae music forever, is what happened at the Lyceum Theatre in London on a July night in 1975. The room is full, thousands of people, and when Bob Marley steps up and sings the opening line, something shifts. The crowd starts singing, not because they were told to, because they could not help it, because that song had already gotten inside them and made a home there. That is the night, that is the version, that is number 1. No Woman, No Cry was first released in 1974 as a single from the Natty Dread album, a song that comforts a woman living through poverty and struggle in the ghetto. With the lyrics carry that specific Kingston memory, the government yard in Trenchtown, the logwood fire, the porridge, the friends who are now gone. But the live version recorded at the Lyceum and released on the live album is on a different level. It is one of the greatest live recordings in the history of popular music, not just reggae. Marley stretches out the chorus until it becomes a prayer. The band locks in. The crowd answers. And something happens in that room that no amount of studio production could ever manufacture. The song has since been covered by Joan Baez, Boney M., the Fugees, and dozens of other artists. It is known in virtually every country on earth, but nothing touches that July night at the Lyceum.
No woman, no cry.
The Lyceum concerts in July 1975 are widely regarded as the moment Bob Marley became a global superstar. Now, the performances were so powerful that Island Records rushed to release the live recording. What was supposed to be a document of a tour became one of the most important reggae albums ever made. And at the center of it, one ballad. One slow, aching, beautiful ballad about sitting with someone you love and telling them it is going to be all right. Because No Woman, No Cry, Live at the Lyceum is not just a song, it is a document, it is proof of what reggae can do when the right voice finds the right room on the right night. Every other song on this list is hidden, overlooked, buried under bad deals and poor distribution, but this one escaped. This one reached the whole world, and because it did, because it carried the soul of Jamaica into every home it entered, reggae music was never the same again. Number 1 for 50 years and counting. There was never going to be another choice.